On my wedding day, my father slipped an old brass key into my hand and whispered, "Use this the day she cheats." I thought he was trying to ruin the happiest moment of my life. But 12 years later, when I finally used that key, I uncovered a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and my father himself. Just seconds before I said, "I do," my father slipped an old brass key into my hand and whispered, "Use this the day she cheats." Then he walked away as if he'd just told me the weather. The string quartet was playing. My mother was crying happy tears. Guests were smiling, taking photos, raising glasses. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, I stood there staring at a small, worn key resting in my palm. At first, I thought he was joking. My father never joked. I looked across the room at my fiancée. She was laughing with my little niece, sunlight pouring through the windows behind her. She looked like every good thing that had ever happened to me. Cheats? The word itself felt insulting. I caught up to my father near the back of the hall. "What kind of thing is that to say on my wedding day?" I asked. He didn't look angry. He didn't look bitter. If anything, he looked sad. "Just keep it," he said quietly. "Why would I ever need this? Because life surprises people." Then he turned and walked away. I looked down at the key again. It was old, heavy, and strangely warm from his hand. I wanted to throw it into the nearest trash can. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket. A few minutes later, my bride reached for my hand. "Everything okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah," I lied. "Everything's perfect." She smiled back and squeezed my fingers. I had no idea that the small piece of brass hidden inside my pocket carried a secret my father had guarded for years, and a warning he desperately hoped I would never understand himself. The first year of our marriage felt like a dream that had somehow become real. We bought a tiny house with squeaky floors and a leaking faucet. We painted the walls together, argued over furniture, and celebrated when we finally hung our first family photo in the living room. The years that followed were filled with ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. One summer, we stood in our backyard planting a tree and promised to watch it grow old with us. Another year, we danced barefoot in our kitchen after the electricity went out. Those memories became the proof that we were building lasting. We took road trips with no destination. We stayed up late talking about our future. We celebrated anniversaries in little restaurants and laughed about how we still felt like newlyweds. She remembered every birthday in my family. She made coffee for me every morning. On difficult days, she somehow knew exactly when I needed silence and when I needed a hug. Every now and then, while looking for old documents, I would find the brass key. It was always in the same wooden drawer, and every single time, I heard my father's voice. "Use this the day she cheats." I would stare at the key for a few seconds, shake my head, and put it back. I never told my wife it existed. Not because I believed she would betray me. I didn't. I simply refused to let a strange warning become a shadow hanging over our marriage. My father occasionally called and asked the same question. "Still have the key?" I hated that question. It made me feel as though he was waiting for something terrible to happen. Eventually, I snapped. "Why can't you just believe I married a good person?" I asked him. There was a long silence. Then he replied, "I do." That answer somehow irritated me even more. I became convinced that my father simply didn't trust anyone. Maybe age had made him cynical. Maybe life had made him suspicious. I stopped trying to understand the key, and as the years passed, it became nothing more than an old object hidden inside a drawer. Our marriage seemed nearly perfect. At least, that's what I believed. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening, everything I thought I knew about my marriage suddenly stopped making sense. It started on a Tuesday. She came home almost 2 hours later than usual. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled, kissed my cheek, and said work had been crazy. I believed her. She even apologized for worrying me and asked if I wanted leftovers she had brought home from the restaurant nearby. A week later, it happened again. Then again. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get busy. Projects pile up. Deadlines appear out of nowhere. But little things began to change. She started carrying her phone everywhere. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter without a second thought. Now it never left her side. Sometimes I would walk into a room and she'd quickly lock the screen. I hated that I noticed. I hated that it bothered me. Then she mentioned an unexpected overnight trip for work. A month later, there was another. Whenever I asked questions, her answers felt shorter than usual. Not suspicious, just incomplete. I kept searching for reasonable explanations, because reasonable explanations were easier to live with. I mentioned it to a couple of friends. They laughed. "You're overthinking this," one of them said. "She's your wife, not a secret agent." I laughed too, but that night I couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, my father's words came back with perfect clarity. "Use this the day she cheats." I pushed the thought away. Then it came back, and then it stayed. One evening, I left work early and drove past a small cafe downtown. That's when I saw her. She was getting out of a car. A man I had never seen before was sitting behind the wheel. They spoke for a few seconds. Then she smiled. Not a romantic smile, not necessarily, just a smile. But my heart dropped anyway. She looked up and saw me. For a split second, the color disappeared from her face. Then she walked toward me. "It's work-related," she said quickly. "He's helping organize something for the company." I nodded. I even smiled. But doubt had already entered the room, and once doubt walks in, it rarely leaves quietly. That night, she fell asleep beside me. I stayed awake. I looked at the ceiling and replayed every late arrival, every locked phone, every short answer. Would you trust your spouse, or would you trust your instincts? Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked to the living room. I opened the wooden drawer. The brass key was exactly where I had left it. I held it in my hand and stared at it for a long time. Then, I noticed something I had somehow missed all these years. Tiny letters were engraved on one side. The key wasn't. "Just old, it had an address on it, I didn't..." Wait until morning. I grabbed my keys, got into my car and typed the address into my phone. It led me across town to an older, industrial district I had driven through dozens of times but never really noticed. The address belonged to a storage facility. I sat there in silence. Father had rented a storage unit? Why? I walked inside and found the unit number engraved beneath the address on the key. With a shaking hand, I slid the brass key into the lock. It opened. Inside was a small room filled with neatly stacked boxes. There were photo albums, folders, and a metal cash box. I found copies of important documents with my name on them, emergency contact information, and savings bonds that had been purchased over many years. Then, I noticed a small television and an old video player. A tape sat beside it, written on the label. Were 4 words, "If you're watching this." I pressed play. My father appeared on the screen looking much younger. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Son, if you found this place, then something has happened. Maybe your marriage is in trouble. Maybe it isn't. But either way, it's time for me to tell you something." He paused. "When I discovered my own wife had betrayed me, I lost more than my marriage. I lost my savings. I lost my home. I lost myself for a while." I stared at the screen. I had known my grandmother died when my father was young. I had never known my grandfather's story. "I made myself a promise," he continued. "If I ever had a son, I would make sure he was never trapped by heartbreak or disaster." He pointed toward the boxes surrounding him. "Everything here exists for one reason: freedom, emergency money, important documents, resources, a way forward." I felt my throat tighten. He had never been teaching me to be suspicious. He had been teaching me to be prepared. Then, my father smiled sadly. "I don't expect your wife to betray you. I expect life to surprise you. People prepare for fires without hoping their homes burn down." I sat there for a long time after the video ended. The old key suddenly felt much heavier. For years, I had mistaken my father's caution for cynicism. In reality, it had been love. I looked around the storage unit one last time and closed the lid on the metal cash box, but I still didn't know one thing. Had my wife actually betrayed me? The next morning, I found my wife sitting at the kitchen table. I couldn't carry the questions anymore. "Who is he?" I asked quietly. She looked up at me. "The man in the car." For a moment, she simply stared. Then her eyes filled with tears. I felt my stomach sink. She wasn't angry. She looked devastated. "I wanted it to be perfect," she whispered.
I didn't understand. She stood up, walked into the bedroom, and returned carrying a folder. Inside were photographs, reservation confirmations, and handwritten notes. At the top was a brochure for a small lakeside venue. "Our anniversary is next month," she said. "I was planning a surprise renewal of our vows." I blinked. "The man you saw is an event planner." She began crying. "I was trying so hard to keep it secret that I ended up making you feel like I was hiding something terrible." The room became completely silent. Then all the fear, doubt, and sleepless nights seemed to collapse at once. I sat down and covered my face with my hands. I wasn't losing my marriage. I had almost allowed suspicion to damage it. When I finally looked up, I told her everything. I told her about the key. I told her what my father had said on our wedding day. At first, she laughed in disbelief. Then she listened to the entire story. By the end, tears were running down her face again. A few days later, we drove to my father's house together. I handed him the brass key. He smiled and pushed it back toward me. "I never wanted you to become paranoid," he said. "I only wanted you to know that surviving heartbreak is possible." For the first time, I understood that my father had taken his pain and turned it into preparation instead of bitterness. He had spent decades carrying a wound he never fully discussed, yet instead of teaching me fear, he had quietly built a safety net and called it love. My wife squeezed my hand. I squeezed hers back. Trust and preparation were not enemies. Love required both courage and honesty. Preparing for hardship didn't mean expecting disaster. And trusting someone completely didn't mean ignoring life's uncertainties. That old brass key never unlocked evidence of betrayal. It unlocked something far more important, a lesson my father learned the hard way. Trust people with your whole heart, but never be so unprepared that heartbreak destroys your future.